Welcome back to the Medieval Archives Podcast, the podcast for medieval news, history, and entertainment. I'm your host, Gary, aka The Archivist. Now, in today's episode, we're going to discuss King John II of France, called the Good. Now, John ruled during a tumultuous time. The plague was in full force, killing large parts of France's population. The 100 Years' War was raging, and France was in dire financial trouble. With all that was going on, how did John get dubbed the Good? We'll take a look at his rise to the throne, his exploits in battle, and on the home front to see if he truly was a good king. Before we get into the episode, I want to give a thanks to Linda, Steve, and Jonathan for their great donations. And if you're enjoying the show and getting value from it, consider supporting the show with a financial donation. It helps keep the show and the website ad-free and full of great content. There are some great donations. There's the $10.66 for the William the Conqueror fans, or the $14.85 to commemorate the Battle of Bosworth. So contribute any amount. Visit medievalarchives.com/support if you'd like to make a donation. If you have any questions or comments or have a topic you've been dying to hear on the show, send those over to podcast@medievalarchives.com, or you can leave a message on our voicemail line, 720-722-1066. Now, the show notes for this episode about John the Good will be at medievalarchives.com/81. So with that, let's jump into medieval France and look at King John the Good. John the Good. Like most subjects, before you can jump into the history of John and his reign, we need to look back at his father, Philip VI, and his rise to power. It helps set the stage for all the obstacles that John is going to face throughout his life. So Philip VI became king of France through a series of events. While not underhanded, certainly played fast and loose with existing laws. When Charles IV died in 1328, he left no male heirs. However, the queen was pregnant with a potential heir. Now, barring the birth of the future heir, if it was a son, the next in line for the throne was Charles's nephew through his sister, a man named Edward. Only the French nobles were steadfast in their refusal to have Edward crowned the king of France. They were not going to have it. The Edward in question happened to be Edward III, the King of England. In no way were the French nobles ready to accept the King of England as the King of France. It brings up a lot of interesting scenarios, though, and it's a fun what-if kind of game to play. The 100 Years' War was started because Edward III was snubbed by the French. Had he been named King of France, there would have been no 100 Years' War. No Crécy, no Battle of Agincourt, no Joan of Arc. I'm sure there would be ongoing skirmishes with pockets of resistance not accepting the rule of an English king, but 150 years of war could have been avoided, and it would have changed the landscape of Europe forever. So Edward was out as a potential king, and to make it official, the French nobility leaned on an 800-year-old Frankish Salic law to solidify their choice. Now, the Salic law stated that female heirs weren't eligible to rule. When Charles died, the nobles took liberties with the interpretation and decided that any male heir who would inherit the throne through the female line was also ineligible to rule, which ruled out Edward because his claim came through the female side. With Edward officially disqualified, the nobles turned to Charles's cousin, a man named Philip, and the grandson of the late King Philip III. The nobles were going way back here to avoid Edward as the king. Philip III died in 1285, 43 years before Charles's death. It's what they had to do to get a Frenchman on the throne and avoid Edward as the king. Philip is named regent of France until the widowed queen can give birth to her child, and the queen gave birth on April 1st, 1328, to a girl. So Philip was named king and crowned King Philip VI in the Reims Cathedral on 28 May, 1328. Philip's reign wasn't great. Edward III of England kicked off the 100 Years' War, and the French Navy was annihilated at the Battle of Sluis. Now, there's an episode on that battle at medievalarchives.com/66. Philip was defeated at the Battle of Crécy, and he lost Calais to the English. The French refused to raise any money for Philip to launch a counterattack. Then, in 1348, the Black Death hit France, killing over a third of the population before it was done. It even killed Philip's first wife, Queen Joan. A rising labor shortage from the plague caused inflation to rise and destabilize the country. Philip chose to remarry and picked Blanche of Navarre for his wife. Only there was one problem. Blanche was already betrothed to Philip's son, John. When Philip married Blanche, a girl who was 40 years younger than him, he upset the nobles and his son John. Philip would die within 2 years of this marriage on 22 August 1350, leaving the unstable Kingdom of France to his son, 31-year-old John. All the uncertainty wasn't just handed to John unknowingly. John was born to Philip and his first wife, Joan of Burgundy, on 26 April 1319. While Philip ruled as king, Prince John was groomed to one day take the throne. John turned 13 on 26 April 1332. The next day, he was given lordship of Normandy, Anjou, and Maine. In July 1332, he married the 13-year-old Princess Beaune of Bohemia, the daughter of King John the Blind. And as if that wasn't enough for a teenager, in September of that same year, he was knighted in the Notre Dame Cathedral. That's pretty impressive for a 13-year-old. When I turned 13, I rode my bike to the arcade and went to the movies with some friends. Now, as the Duke of Normandy, John had a big responsibility. Normandy sits on the northwest coast of France and was ruled by England for over 200 years. When William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, sailed to England in 1066 and became William the Conqueror, King of England, he kept control of Normandy. It wasn't until 1204, when King John of England lost the Normandy campaigns, that Normandy would be ruled by the French. In 1332, when Prince John, now also Duke of Normandy, arrives in Normandy, the region is heavily dependent on trade with the English, more so than the French. A majority of the noblemen and landowners in Normandy held land in England as well. Land passed down from their ancestors and land that they had purchased. Now they were reluctant to side with either king, knowing that picking a side would most likely result in their land being confiscated. Now because of this conflict, Normandy was somewhat of an autonomous region, ruled over by the Counts of Tancarville and Harcourt, who of course were rivals. In 1341, a year after the Battle of Sluis, an uprising in Normandy led by Geoffrey de Harcourt rose up, demanding Geoffrey be named the Duke of Normandy. Prince John sent in royal troops to put down the rebellion. Geoffrey and his men were captured and imprisoned. Geoffrey was exiled to Brabant, while 3 of his men were eventually beheaded in Paris. As the 100 Years' War rolled on and more uprisings occurred in Normandy, with the rebels paying homage to King Edward of England and not to France. The French defeat at Crécy, and France giving Calais back to the English, only emboldened the rebels in Normandy. The exiled Geoffrey de Harcourt played a major role in the Battle of Crécy. Edward named him the commander of the English army, and Geoffrey provided the English men and logistical support while in Normandy. Geoffrey even guarded Edward the Black Prince during the Battle of Crécy. King Philip had enough and ordered John to make a truce with Geoffrey. For the truce, John offered Geoffrey an official pardon, returned all confiscated land, and appointed him sovereign captain of Normandy with permission to collect taxes and levy troops. Geoffrey accepted these generous terms and switched alliances to the French. Hearing of the change in alliance, Edward III confiscated all of Geoffrey's lands in England. Now, having secured the Harcourt family, John turned to the Tancarvilles. John arranged a marriage between the Tancarville family and another prominent family in Normandy, which secured their loyalty. Now, with the majority of families on his side, John quelled the problems in Normandy. Before we move on, let's take a quick side trip to see what becomes of Geoffrey de Harcourt. Now, he would again switch sides when in 1355 he refuses to pay homage to the King of France. Now, during a banquet, John, who was the king at this time, arrested Geoffrey's nephew and had him executed without trial. John tried to capture Geoffrey, but he escaped and allied himself with Edward III again. And then in November of 1356 in St. Clement's, Geoffrey was surrounded by royal troops. He chose to fight to the death instead of being captured and executed. It's a complicated thing serving 2 masters. All right, let's get back to John. Now, he's still prince, and it's 1348, and he's settled the upstarts in Normandy. Not long after the Normandy truce, tragedy would befall John. In September of 1349, his first wife, Princess Beaune, died of the plague. In December of that same year, his mother Joan also died of the plague, and later the next year, in August of 1350, John's father, King Philip VI, died. Shortly after his wife's death and prior to becoming the king, John remarried. In February 1350, he married Joan, Countess of Auvergne, who was also a widow. Her husband died in battle, not from the plague. Now, John and his first wife had 8 children together, so there was no pressure on Joan to give him an heir. So here we are in September 1350. 3 important people in John's life have died in the last year, but with a new wife, on 26 September 1350, John was crowned King John II, and his wife Joan was crowned queen. Now, as tragic as his reign started, things were relatively calm the first few years. It wasn't until 1355 when Edward the Black Prince took an army to France and started to raid the country. Now, Edward's army was stopped at Tours, unable to take the castle. Due to heavy rainfall, they were unable to burn it too. The delay at Tours allowed John to catch up with Edward, and on 19 September 1356, the two armies would meet at the Battle of Poitiers. Now, John led the French army, which was composed of French soldiers, German knights, and a large contingent of Scottish soldiers. All total, the French mustered around 40,000 men. Now, Edward and his army consisted of about 10,000 men. King John was extremely confident he would be victorious. Before the battle started, a conference was held between the two sides to see if they could broker a truce. The English offered to hand over all that they had pillaged while in France and a 7-year peace deal. King John, confident with his army, declined the proposal. John offered a counteroffer saying Edward and his army should surrender. That offer was rejected as well. With neither side agreeing to the terms of the truce, a battle was the only option. The battle started, and Edward the Black Prince used the same strategy his father used at Crécy. The English longbowmen devastated the charging French and German knights. The English didn't target the knights in their armor, they aimed for the horses, shooting them in the sides and the rear where they had little to no armor. As the knights' charge was failing, the French sent in the infantry. As the first wave of infantry were beaten back and regrouped, the second wave started an outright retreat. The final push for the French was led by King John himself. The English were out of arrows and had joined in the hand-to-hand combat. Some of them even mounted horses and formed a makeshift cavalry. Edward the Black Prince called in his reserve units, and the French attempted a full, unorganized retreat. In the confusion of the retreat, King John and his son Philip the Bold were surrounded and captured. The famous French chronicler Jean Froissart recorded the king's capture, writing this: "A knight approached the French king and said in good French, 'Sir, yield you?' The king beheld the knight and said, 'To whom shall I yield me? Where is my cousin, the Prince of Wales? If I might see him, I would speak with him.' Denis answered and said, 'Sir, he is not here, but yield you to me, and I shall bring you to him.' 'Who be you?' quoth the king. 'Sir,' quoth he, 'I am Denis of Marbach, a knight of Artois, but I serve the King of England because I am banished the realm of France, and I have forfeited all I had there.' Then the king gave him his right gauntlet, saying, 'I yield to you.'" When the French army saw the king surrender, they disbanded and left the battlefield. The battle was another massive defeat for the French and killed a large number of the French. Edward the Black Prince wrote of the battle, saying this: "It was agreed that we should take our way, flanking them in such a manner that if they wished for battle or to draw towards us, in a place not very much to our disadvantage, we should be the first. The enemy was discomfited, and the king was taken, and his son, and a great number of other people were both taken and slain." The after-action report is dismal. The Duke of Bourbon, the Constable of France, and Jean de Clermont, the Marshal of France, were killed in the battle. Over 2,000 French POWs were taken, including King John, his son Philip the Bold, 17 lords, 13 counts, and over 100 French knights. Not a good day for the French. Hours after the battle, Edward, the Black Prince, made a supper for King John and the French prisoners. Chronicler Jean Froissart wrote of the occasion. He wrote, "On the same day at night, at battle, the prince made a supper in his lodging to the French king and to the most part of the great lords that were prisoners. The prince made the king and his son, the Lord John d'Artois, the Earl of Tankerville, the Earl of Estampes, to all sit at one board, and other lords, knights, and squires at other tables, and always the prince served before the king as humbly as he could, and would not sit at the king's board for any desire that the king could make, but he said he was not sufficient to sit at the table with so great a prince as the king was. But when he said to the king, 'Sir, for God's sake, make none evil nor heavy cheer, though God this day did not consent to follow your will, for, sir, surely the king my father shall bear you as much honor and amity as he may do, and shall accord with you so reasonable that ye shall be friends together after. Following the battle, King John was taken to the English stronghold in Bordeaux and then sent to England. In England, he spent time in the Savoy Palace and in Windsor Castle before ending up in the Tower of London. Now, while John was held prisoner, he enjoyed a plush lifestyle. The English granted him all royal privileges and allowed him to travel within England. According to the accounts he kept during his captivity, John was buying horses and clothes, kept a royal astrologer, and even had a court band. Sounds like a pretty horrible imprisonment, if you ask me. But as you might imagine, when a king is captured by the enemy, there's a lot of turmoil and political maneuvering back on the home front. While John toiled away in his captivity, the Dauphin of France, Prince Charles, returned to Paris and tried to raise money so he could raise an army and free his father. While the French were fighting amongst themselves, the English were also ravaging the country. Prince Charles wanted to increase taxes to establish a standing army in order to defend France. Charles called the Estates General together in October of 1356. Now, the Estates General was the legislative body in France made up of the three classes, or estates as they called them. The estates were the clergy, the noblemen, and the commoners. You can think of it like the British Parliament or American Congress, roughly. When Charles called them together, they refused to raise money, stating that poor leadership under King John as their reason. The Estates General instead demanded concessions from the young prince, who refused and then dismissed the Estates General completely. A few months later, in February of 1357, the Third Estates, which was the commoners, led by a man named Marcel, presented Prince Charles with the Grand Ordinance. The ordinance consisted of 61 articles that reduced the power of the monarchy, taxed the nobility class, and reorganized the governing body of France, among about 57 other things. Prince Charles refused the ordinance, but under heavy pressure from the estates, he finally agreed. King John, still held by the English, heard of the ordinance and denounced it. For the next 14 months, France was embattled in a political struggle while the king remained a prisoner in England. In February of 1358, Marcel and his mob stormed the palace, murdered two nobles right in front of Prince Charles. Fearing the mob violence unfolding, Charles fled Paris. Marcel was assassinated by royal guards a few months later in July of 1358, and Charles reestablished his rule in Paris. In the end, the Grand Ordinance was a short-lived attempt to restructure the monarchy and politics in France. While France was in political strife, King John was working hard on his side to get released. He and King Edward III worked out an initial treaty which was signed in 1359. The treaty gave the majority of western France to England and a ransom paid to England of 4 million crowns. John signed it, but Prince Charles refused, stating as a regent of France he must agree to any treaty. As you'd expect, Charles' refusal upset Edward, who decided it was a good time to invade France again and forced Charles to accept the terms of the treaty. So Edward and his army headed toward France, and they reached Paris in March of 1360, but they couldn't get Charles to confront them in direct battle. In April of 1360, the two sides began to negotiate a new treaty. The treaty, called the Treaty of Brétigny, named after the town where it was signed, gave a good portion of southwestern France, the Aquitaine region, and Calais in the north to Edward in England. It also changed the title from Duke of Aquitaine to Lord. I put a picture up on the website with the show notes so you can see how much of France England owned. It's about a third of the country. Edward and all the future kings of England held the territory free and clear. They didn't have to pay homage to the King of France for it, which was the case when the King of England was also the Duke of Normandy. As for England, they gave back a few duchies too. Anjou, Maine, and Brittany, and a couple others returned to French control. Now, as bad as the land grab was, the ransom owed to England was worse. The terms of the treaty called for France to pay England 3 million crowns. That's roughly $2 billion US in today's money. Billion with the B. That's a lot of cash to get your king back. I can't imagine asking the population, who, oh, by the way, is already fed up with the king, to dig deep and give the king all your money. The treaty was agreed upon and ratified in October of 1360 by King Edward, King John, and their sons Edward the Black Prince and the Dauphin Charles. The stipulation of the treaty stated that John would be released once France paid 1 million crowns. The other 2 million would be paid over time. Now, as a guarantee for the ransom, John gave several hostages to England, including his son Louis I, the newly minted Duke of Anjou, and John the Duke of Berry, several nobles, 4 citizens of Paris, and 2 citizens from each of the major cities of France, a total of 83 hostages in all. While they were held hostage, John returned to France to raise the ransom money. The ransom was to be paid within 6 months. 3 years later, in 1363, John still hadn't raised the money for the ransom. His son Louis was sick of being held hostage and tried cutting a deal with Edward, and when that failed, he escaped captivity. Louis arrived back in France in the summer of 1363. Now, King John felt honor-bound to his word and voluntarily returned to England for imprisonment, much to the dismay of his council, and once again the citizens of France were without a king. John arrived in London in January of 1364. Shortly after, he became ill, and he died in captivity in April of 1364. The original hostages were released years after King John's death. His other son, John of Berry, was released in 1369, and he died in Paris at the age of 75 in 1416. King John's body was returned to France and interred in the royal chambers in Saint-Denis Basilica. Only King John knows why he decided to return to England as a prisoner. Some speculate that ruling France was too much of a burden with all the domestic strife, war, and disease, while living as a royal prisoner in England was kind of a plush life, all the benefits of the king and none of the responsibility. Others argue he wanted to negotiate with Edward directly. France was legally bound to that ransom through the treaty, and they continued to pay that ransom to England over the next 50 years until the reign of Henry V. That treaty also brought a brief 9-year period of peace in the 100 Years' War. King John is described as having fragile health. He rarely engaged in any physical activity. He was quick to anger and had a violent temper, which led to heated arguments with his council and nobles. It's said he preferred the arts more than anything, yet somehow he is remembered as a warrior king, mostly due to his courage during the Battle of Poitiers. Now, surrounded and beaten, he fought till the very end, finally surrendering as the last resort. Now, one other aspect of his warrior king persona is part of his legacy. John, not to be outdone by Edward III of England, created the Order of the Star, an order of chivalry. Now, King Edward in England created the Order of the Garter in 1348. So in 1351, John created his own order of chivalry called the Order of the Star. The main goal of the order was to prevent another disaster that France suffered at the Battle of Crécy. Members of the order received a small amount of payment, and the order provided housing when the knights retired. The knights of the order were sworn to never retreat from battle. Now, to the knights' credit, they lived and died by that oath. In the Battle of Meran in 1352, over 90 knights died in battle. At the Battle of Poitiers, over 100 knights of the Order of the Star were killed on the battlefield. And the oath led to the capture of King John, who wouldn't break his word and kept fighting until surrender was the only option. The Order of the Star was short-lived, though. I guess when all your members swear to fight to the death and then get massacred, it's hard to recruit new members. So the order didn't survive long after King John, but it did set the stage for other chivalric orders. King John II was the king of France for 14 years, and he spent much of his time as a prisoner in England. After the death of King John, his son Charles was crowned Charles V and would be called the Wise. Charles would reignite the 100 Years' War and set about to regain the territories lost by his father. But that story is for another episode. Well, that's going to end our look at King John the Good of France. Now, if you want to learn more about King John, check out the list of books I used while researching this lesson. And you can find them in the show notes at medievalarchives.com/81. Now, one I would highly recommend is called A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman. Now, it's a little bit older book, but it still holds up. You can get a free audio copy of it on Audible by going to medievalarchives.com/freebook and then just sign up for the free trial, which you can cancel at any time. Pick a distant mirror for your free book, and it's yours to keep forever. We use Audible extensively in our house. The kids use it. My wife uses it. It's a great service. Send your thoughts, comments, and questions to podcast@medievalarchives.com. And don't forget to check out the website for more great features at medievalarchives.com. Thanks for your time, and thanks for your continued support. And that's going to wrap up another great episode of the Medieval Archives podcast. Thanks again for subscribing and listening to the Medieval Archives podcast, illuminating the dark ages for the digital world.
The Medieval Archives podcast, the podcast for medieval news, history, and entertainment. If you have any questions, comments, topic ideas, or would like to sponsor an episode, send an email to podcast@medievalarchives.com. Audio files are welcome. You can call in your question or comment to 720-722-1066. International and long-distance charges may apply. Visit Medieval Archives at medievalarchives.com. You can also follow Medieval Archives on Facebook at facebook.com/Medieval Archives and on Twitter at twitter.com/Medieval Archive for all your daily medieval updates.